me, you cannot be an officer in the U.S. Army or the U.S. military and hate Jews, blacks, and gays. But it exists. But being an oath keeper is an affront to the basic nature of being an officer and of being a West Point graduate.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today on the show, we have Iraq War veteran Ivan Hodes. We discuss Ivan's background, his deployment to Iraq, and his military service alongside fellow West Point graduate Representative David Eastman. We then discuss Ivan's quest to get Eastman disqualified from elected office. This interview expresses one individual's personal experience and opinions regarding Representative Eastman's case. I will hopefully be interviewing others for their personal perspectives on this issue in the future. Well, Ivan Hodes, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana. My dad was a constitutional law professor at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and that's in large part how I got interested in the Constitution and politics and things of that nature.
And your mom?
My mom was also an attorney. She worked for the United Auto Workers in its capacity as an organization, rather than the labor stuff. But she left the workforce when I was quite young and never went back. And she sometimes assists my dad with legal stuff. He has his own. He's more or less retired now down in Florida. But for a while, he had his own private practice, which he's gradually been phasing out. And she did some assistance with him, but she mostly focused on raising me.
You're
her only child, yeah.
Only child. When did you join the military?
So I enrolled as a cadet in the summer of 2001. The idea of not going to college was essentially like an alien concept to me. Like, I don't think I even knew until I was in about middle school that some people didn't go to college. It was just like that baked into my family culture, the culture of the schools that I attended. Literally 100% of my classmates went to college. It was never, are you going to college? It was which college you're going to. So it never really occurred to me to enlist. The goal, the objective was always West Point, which was how it happened. So I began cadet basic training in July of 2001, July 2nd, and obviously September 11th happened right at the beginning of that first academic year, and then I graduated from West Point in 2005, May 28th.
And when you graduated, I know that you deployed.
I did.
What was the distance of time between graduation and deployment?
I graduated in May of 2005, as I said. I went down to Fort Benning for infantry officer basic training and ranger school and airborne school and all the infantry stuff. And so I was down there until the spring of 2006. I drove up to Alaska, got here right about Memorial Day 2006, and then my unit, 4th Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, deployed to Iraq in about September of that year. So about a year and a half from graduation to being in the combat zone.
And what was your experience like in Iraq?
Unpleasant. Actually, even before I graduated, I'd realized or come to the conclusion that the war was a strategic mess, an operational mess, a tactical mess, a moral mess, and I was not looking forward to it. I knew it was going to be stupid, and I knew it was going to not make sense, but I remember thinking about my idol then and now, Ulysses Grant, who, as a young officer, found himself in the Mexican-American War, thoroughly disagreeing with it, but believing that it was his obligation as an officer, which is also a topic that we covered in the philosophy classes at West Point. What do you do when the war is wrong or immoral or doesn't make sense? And the book answer is, well, you go fight in it anyway, and you do so in a moral way, or a way that's as moral as possible, I guess. In practice, I found that a lot harder than it was in theory. Specifically ordering kids, and I think even then I thought of them as kids because I was 4 or 5 years older than most of them. So ordering kids to risk their lives for something that I thought was bullshit was tough on me. But there was a point when I was ordered to carry out a mission that I couldn't see the purpose of, and I thought was immoral, basically. So I asked to be relieved as a platoon leader. And I was, and that basically ended my career. So I was given a reprimand and passed over for promotion and all that stuff. So I was out of the Army after just 4 years. It's supposed to be 5 if you go to West Point as a first lieutenant. So yeah, all in all, it was not the most fun I've ever had.
Some context that I'll offer for our listeners, because I think there's a misconception about this. I think people think that it's worse to have been deployed to Afghanistan than to have been deployed to Iraq. But my understanding as somebody who was not deployed to either location is that actually in Afghanistan, which was a place where they'd had wars since, decades before, the people tended to not show hatred to the Americans directly in front of them. That there was a little bit more like that they're siding with whomever they think is in charge in front of them right now. Whereas in Iraq, there was a lot more overt disdain and hatred towards.
Yeah, there was a lot of hostility. Since I didn't go to Afghanistan, I can't really compare. I will say that a huge part of the reason that I requested to be assigned in Alaska in the first place was because I thought that an airborne brigade that trained in a cold weather mountainous environment would be sent to Afghanistan. And the reasons for that is, first and foremost, at least in 2006, Afghanistan made a lot more sense strategically. I think it eventually lost any purpose as well, but Iraq really was founded on misinformation, essentially, right? And I'd already figured that out by 2005, 2006. And I thought the good fight, so to speak, was in Afghanistan. And also I just thought that Afghanistan was a more interesting place where I would have found both the nature of the combat and the nature of the environment more interesting. But of course, that's a silly reason. But the main one was Iraq didn't make any fucking sense to me, and Afghanistan did. And I remember thinking, God, this is going to be so terrible when I went, and it was far worse than I imagined.
So you didn't finish your 5 years,
right?
And you got out early. How did that feel?
Terrible. Like I haven't forgiven myself for it since then. I think the worst part was probably the last year, watching my classmates get promoted, and even worse, the year behind me. People that I'd known as underclassmen at West Point were now captains, and I was still a lieutenant. So it was pretty miserable, and for probably the entirety of my time at West Point, or most of my time at West Point, the only thing that I wanted to do was be an infantry officer, and then I was, and it sucked. I was terrible at it. And so I don't know how to conclude that. You can, I think.
Did you get any support
from
friends, family?
Yeah. My family was always supportive. My friends were supportive. A few of the officers that I went to war with were basically like, "Fuck you, you chickened out." Some were not, and then some came to me later and said, at the time, I was really mad at you, but I went through similar experiences later in my career, and now I get what you're doing. But the biggest thing for me psychologically was I had a classmate who was killed in action about a month before we went home, Tom Martin. And, there's no logical connection, there's no causal connection between my quitting, essentially, and him dying. But in my mind, right, like, I quit and I came home safe, and he didn't. And now he's dead. So that is probably, more so than being passed over promotion, that's probably the hardest part psychologically of everything that happened at the survivor guild.
Did you grow up religious?
No. This is surely going to give fodder to all the lovely people who follow me on Twitter who think I'm a left-wing revolutionary. But my parents were actually former Marxists. They were sort of raised by my dad in particular was raised by a devout, so to speak, Marxist Communist Party member. So they grew up in firmly atheistic households. They were pretty much atheistic themselves. But I don't know, in the way that 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds do, especially me, like coming to this brand new setting. I was looking for something, so I started attending the Jewish chapel at West Point, and for quite a few years, I sort of had a religious framework about the way that I viewed the world, more so than I do now. Not to get too much into theology. I certainly don't consider myself an atheist. I'm somewhere between an agnostic and Jewish, maybe. I think the phrase that I've heard that kind of rings is, "I'm not sure there's a God, but I kind of wish there was." So that kind of thing, which is itself kind of Jewish. If you look in the Bible, there's all kinds of situations where they're questioning God or debating God. So that's kind of the relationship that I have, and I am not as active in the synagogue as I used to be, but I still go from time to time. I'll go for high holidays, and again, it's at least some of it is sort of the desire to have that identity, right? To be part of a community.
Did your parents identify culturally as Jewish?
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to say especially my dad, but they did. I did go to a Jewish community center for preschool, so I've always been aware of at least an ethnic Jewish identity, and then for some time, and to some extent still today, it's been added to with a religious identity. And during the incident that we talked about in Iraq, where I was like, I believe this mission is immoral, that was very much guided by sort of a religious sense, like, what I believe about how Jews are supposed to behave in the world does not permit me to carry out this mission.
Did you have any Jewish friends in the military?
Oh, yeah. Especially at West Point. My year group just happened to have a maybe slightly larger than average Jewish population. Typically, about 2% of the student body at West Point is Jewish. So there's about 1,000 people, per West Point class. 2% of that is 20, right? So there's maybe 25, and there was about 5 or 6 of us who sort of an unusually, especially tight-knit and active group, and 2 in particular. Again, being an only child, I really considered like brother and sister, still do to some extent. Once I got out into the force, less so, especially being in an airborne infantry brigade. Jews are underrepresented in the combat arms.
Were you the only one?
Was I the only Jew? No. For sure, there was a Jewish enlisted soldier in my squadron, even, and I think there were a couple other Jewish soldiers in the brigade. But but there certainly weren't many. I got actually certified as a lay leader at one point, and I would lead the Jewish services at my forward operating base, Fob Falcon, and very many days I was the only person there.
So you just led a service for yourself,
basically. Yeah. Oh, there was a great, really great moment. This one evening, I just went in there like usual, and there was about a dozen. I might get emotional when I'm telling this story, but there were about a dozen black soldiers. I went into the chapel on the fob like I normally did, and there was about a dozen black soldiers in the aisles, in the pews, and I said, "Are you guys here for the Jewish service?" And NCO said, "No, sir. We're the base gospel choir, and we see you coming here every week on your own, and we wanted to share your faith with you." And that's the story that I tell, like, why did you join the Army? Like, why do you love America? Like, that's why. That's the America that I fought to defend, to the extent that I did.
So you came back to Alaska?
So I came back to Alaska, and I remember thinking, actually, when you're a cadet, you have the opportunity to go out to a unit, an operational unit in the Army for a month or so. It's called Cadet Troop Leadership Training. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I probably wouldn't actually want to be stationed in Alaska, but it'd be cool to spend a month there. So I requested it, didn't get it, ended up in Korea. And then this new brigade opened up, and I thought, well, okay, I didn't get to go to Alaska for CTLT, and I wouldn't want to live there, but maybe being stationed there for 3 years would be fun. So that's why I went there. And then pretty quickly, I think maybe even that first spring, I was like, hey, I might want to live here. Pretty soon after I got back in 2007, I decided I was probably gonna stay. And I'd always intended to get into teaching after I left the service. Just left the service a lot sooner than I expected. So it's either that first winter I got back. Oh no, it was 2009, because I still had some of my obligation left. So after I got back,
when you got back, you still had.
I still had some time, and so for a while I was working in the brigade staff of the brigade that I'd been in, and then they were getting ready to go to Afghanistan again, or not again, but for the first time, and I just I was so wrecked by the first deployment. I wouldn't have been wouldn't have been able to do it, essentially. So I more or less requested a transfer. So I spent the last little bit less than a year of my career in a military police battalion, which incidentally is where I first encountered David Eastman.
Because you were colleagues.
And we were colleagues in the battalion, yeah.
And were y'all friends?
Not friends, but certainly no hostility. He was a quiet guy. I was a fairly quiet guy. He didn't make a strong impression on me. I doubt that I made a strong impression on him.
You knew he'd gone to West Point.
I knew he'd gone to West Point, I think. That probably came up. If we ever interacted, as far as I can remember, it was cordial. But I believe I was on staff and he was a company commander. So I don't remember interacting with him that much, but I definitely remember him being there. So things would change later. But
so you want to be a teacher?
I do. Yeah, I want to be a teacher.
Your obligation. You want to be a teacher.
That's right.
History was your degree?
Yeah. So yeah, my thing was history. My degree from West Point was in history, European history, and I sort of had the kind of the classic idea, veteran teaches civics and American history, right?
Like a social studies teacher?
Yeah, like a social studies teacher in high school. And then, so I enrolled in the UAA Masters of Arts in Teaching program in about 2009. the fall of 2009. And then to sort of pay my way through that and get some experience, I was a substitute. And I remember pretty early on substituting for, an 11th grade social studies class. And I was like, I don't know, this isn't that great. And then right around the same time, I subbed in an 8th grade, maybe science, maybe social studies class over at Central. And I was like, I like this more. So I started focusing on becoming a middle school teacher.
So your first job was as a teacher in ADAC on the Aleutian chain. That's a very remote, I'm sure, very interesting experience. You were there for 2 years, and then you were at Diamond High School for a year, then as an elementary school teacher at Orion on J-Bear. Ultimately, you ended up at a Title I school, Taku Elementary, where you were quite unhappy, as I understand it, due to the discipline problems, your inability to teach the way you wanted to teach. And so you'd already turned in your resignation when COVID happens.
Yeah, so COVID happens. I'd already made the decision to leave. I think at one point I actually, because I had some distance from the problem, there were aspects of virtual teaching that I enjoyed. So I got to think, and teaching in general that's who I am. And it's certainly a source of frustration that I can't do it anymore. I found of ways of doing it informally, but that's my calling, right? So it's frustrating to not be able to do your calling. So after getting out of teaching completely, I've basically been working as a DoD civilian. I was at a recreation center on base for a while, and now I'm a test administrator. So I administer the ASVAB test to recruits and also go out to schools and administer it to students. So, which is kind of in a lot of ways it's not as ideal as teaching, but I'm still working with students to some extent. In addition to administering the test, we also go over the results with them, and it's sort of a career exploration thing, and it's basically like coming to the schools and doing the lesson. So I get a little bit of the teaching, I get still working with the military, so it's checking some boxes. It's checking some boxes. It's gotten me to a place where I'm content. Yeah.
It seems challenging to believe that there are listeners who don't know the David Eastman story.
Okay.
But can you give us that story?
Okay. So leaving off from the last time I saw David in person, we were colleagues in this military police battalion, cordial as far as I can remember. I left, I think he might have stayed in maybe one more year, but we left the service around the same time. I believe he got into politics, I think, as soon as he left the service. I think he ran unsuccessfully for Senate maybe a couple times. He won office the first time in 2016, the year that Trump got elected, I think, kind of riding that Trump wave. He actually unseated an incumbent. And I don't remember noticing that. The first time he came across my radar was when he made these comments about Alaska Native women getting abortions. And what he said was something to the effect of, everybody knows, or it's well known, that there are women in these villages who are happy to get pregnant so that they can come to the city for an abortion. And by these villages, obviously he meant Alaska Native women. He knew it. Everybody else knew it. So we actually got censured. And
to be clear, that's not true.
To be clear, that is a gross calumny. Is classic, Trump rhetoric. I heard people say that, there's no evidence for it. It doesn't make any fucking sense. It's dehumanizing, right? Because it ascribes behavior to Alaska Native people that, you wouldn't ascribe to anybody else, right? So I think rightly so. He was censured. I believe it was bipartisan. There were a number of Republicans who did that. Ivy Sponholz was sort of the prime mover of that, and it made the news. And I remember, I think that was the first time I was like, oh, David Eastman. I know that guy. I didn't know he was such an asshole. The next time he really crossed my radar was the Hmong veteran bill. And this is a story that I think is definitely worth telling in detail. So, And I really like telling this story too because, as I mentioned, I'm a history major. I'm particularly interested in Vietnam, and I love talking about Hmong history and culture. It's been an interest of mine since college. So here it goes. During the Vietnam War, there was an ethnic minority that lived in the highlands of northern Vietnam and Laos called the Hmong, Hmong. And they were very strongly, for the most part, anti-communist. The Vietnamese communists and the Laotian communists were not from this part of the country. They basically invaded Hmong territory, tried to take over. The Hmong had been converted to Christianity, so they tended to be pretty staunch Christians, staunch anti-communists. So they were fighting against the Vietnamese and Laotian communists. The CIA had a project to basically train, equip, advise, arm them. So very many Hmong soldiers fought and died fighting communism in Southeast Asia. They died at rates something like 10 times more than American soldiers. An American soldier gets wounded, he gets choppered out to the evacuation hospital in Da Nang. A Hmong soldier got wounded, he died in place. So they suffered extremely terribly. And then when the U.S. left Southeast Asia in 1975, we basically cut and ran, truly. And maybe there was no other policy option, but that's what happened. We armed these guys, we turned them against these two very unfriendly, very powerful communist regimes. Then when we left, they didn't leave, right? So they were stuck. They suffered immense persecution. Possibly the Laotian government subjected them to chemical warfare. That one's still controversial, but certainly they were persecuted. They were persecuted extensively, particularly in Laos, in Vietnam as well. Eventually, they were driven to refugee camps in Thailand. Some years went by, and many of them started to get resettled from these Thai refugee camps to America. One of the places that they were resettled was Anchorage, Alaska. So Anchorage today has a fairly significant Hmong American community, and many members of the community are guys who literally fought alongside Americans against communism in Southeast Asia. Many of them live in Mountain View, so this was a particular interest of Representative Tar's. And in this area, very many other areas, she did great legislative work, and I want to give a shout out to her. I want to give her all the respect in the world for this one in particular. So there was a ceremonial bill that basically said, hey, Hmong veterans are great. Let's honor Hmong veterans. Representative Tar added some substantive policy to this bill. And what the policy basically said was these Hmong veterans can get it on their Alaska driver's license that they're veterans. They get veteran status from the state of Alaska, and they can get the veteran's license plate. There's no benefits that attach to that. They can't do anything about federal benefits because this is just state legislation. So the only thing that it did was basically allow them to go to Lowe's Hardware or wherever and say, hey, I'm a Vietnam veteran. So they get the discounts. So, truly, the least that could possibly be done for, a group of people who fought their asses off on our behalf, right? We went in there, they were up there. We went in there, armed them, turned them against this regime, and then left them holding the bag. And then years later, lifted them into this entirely new country. So literally, the least we can do is allow them to get discounts at Ace Hardware, right? Yeah. Exactly. So Representative Tar attached that bill. Every single other member of the legislature voted for it. David Eastman did not. And the reasoning he gave basically was that it was a race-based policy, and that's obvious bullshit. The reason he objects is because of race. He cannot and will not ever do anything to suggest that anybody other than white people made a contribution to American heritage, essentially. that is his worldview. I'm 100% convinced of it. There's no other way to reconcile that one in particular. So that was the one that really made me mad. Because here's this guy who rants and rails about how, the communists are taking over, and, everybody he disagrees with is a communist. I'm a communist. The leftists are communists. But here are people who actually fought communism, like literally fought communism with guns and stuff. They're coming over here, and he can't allow them to have a fucking discount at the hardware store. So that's when I knew, like, this guy is no good. So fast forward another couple years. I started to notice him more and more as COVID happened. We are Facebook friends. I think by the time I added him as a friend, I think I mostly knew what he was about and just kind of did it to keep an eye on him, and he probably did the same. But
did he know you were a critic at that point?
I think so. And then I remember I certainly saw when he went to D.C. on January 6th to stand with Trump. And at that time, there was a petition. This is not the petition that I did. This is earlier. There was a petition to get him expelled for that. And I remember thinking, like, that's a bit much, but, like, because not as much was known. But, like, censure? Like, probably. Like, elected officials shouldn't be doing that, I thought. And so there was some motion there. It kind of fizzled out. And then I do remember sending him a private message, which was the first time I'd communicated with him directly since we'd known each other in the MP battalion. And it was basically to the effect of, you were a disgrace to the officer corps. Or maybe it's either said disgrace to the officer corps or disgrace to the academy. And he said, that may be so, but I was proud to stand with other members of my class who were there that day. And the thing that really galled me, there's that famous in our little tiny circles of him in D.C. on January 6th, on the grounds of the Capitol, by the way, probably 400 feet maybe from where the Capitol was reached. So FYI, when he says he was nowhere near it, not telling the truth. And in the background is an equestrian statue of my guy, Ulysses S. Grant. And I'm like, an seditionist posing in front of a statue of Grant. What an embarrassment. And I said something like, if you'd been around, you would have joined the Confederacy. Or he said that thing, I was proud to stand with my classmates. And I said, well, a lot of West Point graduates joined the Confederacy. And I'm sure you would have too. And then I don't think he responded to that. So he was certainly well on my radar at that point. And then the lies about vaccines and how dangerous they are started to get over that next summer, 2021, got more and more extreme. And like all the election denialism, he got involved with like the My Pillow guy. He was like flying to Arizona, I think while the legislature was in session, even like to like investigate the election fraud. So it was like deeply weird. About September of 2021, Biden had given a speech about people needing to get vaccinated. And he said something like, we've been patient with you, but our patience is wearing thin. And since apparently Joe Biden and Adolf Hitler are the only two people in world history who have ever used the phrase, my patience is wearing thin, this reminded David, supposedly, of this Adolf Hitler speech. And so he posted a link to the Adolf Hitler speech. And he said something like, I was reminded of this speech, or something that Biden said reminded me of this speech. I wonder why. So first of all, that's weird. Second of all, okay. People make dumb comparisons to Hitler all the time. It's a both side thing. Democrats do it. Republicans do it. I don't like it, but it's a thing. Okay, that's out there. What's not out there is the actual website that he linked to. And it's this like obscure Holocaust denial website. It's the most overt white supremacist Holocaust denial website I think I've ever seen. But just on that, when you follow that link, it's got the text of the speech, and then like next to it is like the International Jew, podcast, or the International Jew discussion group, hollow hoaxes and other frauds. It slaps you in the face. Like, there is no possible way that one can go to that website and not realize what it is. And it's also not something you can search for, right? Because search engine algorithms bury that kind of shit. So like, and if you search for the text of the speech, 1,000 other perfectly reputable websites come up. So nobody does that by accident, and I know that. And so there happened to be a town hall that night with some legislators, both parties. It was, I think it was the Anchorage caucus, and I brought it up. I think it must have been Annie Josephson that I had the most sway with, and like, something needs to be done about this, because like, okay, like, if he's posting it from his personal account, like, fuck you, but he has the right to do that. This was on his official account. This was on the Representative David Eastman Twitter, and it's still up there, by the way. And your listeners can go look at it. But I want to do a content warning. If you click this link, it is heinous. I think people should. What I always say is, like, if I, a Jewish person, can look at this shit, anybody else can look at it and see just how bad it is. See for yourself. Do not take my word for it. So I sort of talked to Andy and a couple other people about, like, can we censor this guy? Can we do something? This is not okay. Like, and let me frame this like very plainly for your listeners. A state representative posted a link to a Holocaust denial website. That's really bad. And it was so bad, in fact, that a friend of mine, Dan Miller, was the head of the West Point Society of Alaska, and he basically called David and said, "Hey, man, like, this is a bad look for the Academy. You're a public figure. You need to take this down, or you will get disinvited from West Point Society of Alaska events." So my basic contention is that nobody ever links to Holocaust denial websites by accident. But in the wildly unlikely event that they did, and somebody pointed it out, they would take down the link and apologize. Did David do that? Did he apologize? No. Did he take the link down? No. Did he get kicked out of the West Point Society of Alaska? Yes. So, again, this is not wild-eyed, left-wing Ivan Hodes noticing this. This is, the West Point Society of Alaska. This is not, the Young Socialists League, right? So it is manifest to anybody who's really looking at this objectively that, like, this is deliberate. He had to have been on that website before to even know about it. So I'm not saying that he's a Holocaust denier. His views on the Holocaust, I've since learned, are weirder and more nuanced than denying it outright. But that is basically the moment when I realized, like, this is not a quote unquote normal, even sort of Trumpy Republican. This is like a no kidding, like, white supremacist. Once you start looking at it in that framework, then everything else makes sense. I don't know if you saw Betsy Paratrovich's post or letter. I basically listed, like, incident after incident after incident of just, like, refusing, like, the most basic courtesies in honor of Alaska Native people. It's commemorative coin against honoring Elizabeth Paratrovich. No. Daily honors for an artist from Nome who had just died, and her family did it. No. And there's always some kind of notional excuse, like with Betsy Paratrovich, like, the country can't afford more gold coins or something like that. Elizabeth Paratrovich, yes. There's always some little fig leaf of excuse, because the way that these folks operate is they want to maintain plausible deniability, right? But this was a slip up to me. So they want to maintain plausible deniability, but they also can't back down, because that shows weakness, in front of, weakness towards the Jews, basically, towards the liberal cucks. You can't apologize, can't back down. So no normal person who wasn't committed to white supremacy would behave that way. no normal person would give the responses that he gave. James Brooks asked him, do you deny the Holocaust? And his response was, no, there's nothing to deny. That's not what a normal person says, right? That's not what a normal person says. So he masks it to some extent, but that was the moment I became 100% convinced this guy is a legit white supremacist with an agenda. But that's legal. It certainly got him much more on my radar than he was before, but it is not illegal to be a white supremacist. It's not illegal to have an SS dagger in your office, which he does. It's not normal either, but hey. What is not illegal, but what does violate the Constitution, is belonging to a group that advocates the violent overthrow of the United States government. So about a month or so after the Holocaust Denial website incident, this, I think it was BuzzFeed maybe, ProPublica, I forget who got it and who published it, but some news organization published a list of Oathkeeper members, and David was on it. And this was when it was publicly known for sure that the Oath Keepers had been intimately involved in the events of January 6th, but it was before, I think even before the indictments, it was before the trial. But if you look at what the text of the Constitution says, it just says advocates. There's no legal standard. It's a vague clause. There are definitely issues with the clause, and I get that and I respect that. So when I found out about the Oath Keepers membership, again, that to me was an even brighter line. There are graduates of the military academy who are anti-Semites and racists. It happens. I wish it wasn't so. To me, you cannot be an officer in the U.S. Army or the U.S. military and hate Jews, blacks, and gays. But it exists. But being an Oath Keeper is an affront to the basic nature of being an officer and of being a West Point graduate. It is a fundamental betrayal of the oath that we swore. And I know that the counterargument is something like, oh, all Oath Keepers are doing is saying that they'll agree to follow the Constitution. Well, first of all, that's dumb, because if you've already sworn the oath, why do you need to swear an oath that you're going to keep the oath that you swore? It doesn't make any sense. But the real issue is that's not actually what the Oath Keepers are. That's what they say they are. So this argument that there's nothing in the Oath Keepers bylaws that call for violence. That's like saying, well, the mafia doesn't have a written document saying that they're going to extort people, but they still extort people, right? So going back to the letter thing, that to me was just a massive affront to. And we talked about how being in the Army and being an Army officer was such an important part of my identity. It just and I probably care more about it than I should, since I'm not an officer anymore. And maybe I should just let this go, but I can't. But the fact that he's a graduate and he's an Oath Keeper, I cannot let that go. So there was a Facebook group of West Point graduates that I was sort of tangentially involved in. If you remember, maybe the spring of 2020, they wrote an open letter to the graduating class of 2020. I'm basically warning them, about Trump, essentially. And I don't think I signed that one. I might have, but I was not very closely involved, but it got me into this group. And the purpose of the group is basically to call public attention to graduates who are public officials who are discrediting the academy. And hey, look, David Eastman. So soon after this Oath Keepers thing, I was like, hey, if this is the purpose of this group, there's this guy that I want you all to know about. He did this, this, and this. And so the consensus was get a letter together, get signatures, and we'll put it out. So I ended up getting about 70 graduates to sign it, including 2 of his classmates. Let me pause there and tell a quick story about that. So one of his classmates who signed it was a guy named Edward Rebrook. Edward is a lawyer in West Virginia who actually defended some of the Charlottesville defendants, the ones who were involved in that Unite the Right rally. I don't remember which particular ones he did, but Not that he believes in their cause in any sense, but, because everybody's entitled to a criminal defense, which I 1,000% agree with. He was their lawyer, and so he became familiar with it. When I first started doing this petition, he was very much, or the latter rather, he was very much against it. He was like, "You're bullying this guy. Like, if you have a problem with him, like, challenge him to a duel." He meant that, kind of lightheartedly, but, you shouldn't be using the imprimatur of, the academy and, getting strength in numbers and like that to go after this guy. And then, like, we were sort of arguing back and forth, and assuming that he already knew it, I mentioned the Holocaust denial thing, and he was like, "Wait, he's a Holocaust denier?" And so I showed him the website, and I showed him the response that he gave, and instantly, because he'd worked with Nazis before, he recognized the tricks, and he was like, this is absolutely 1,000% what this guy believes. The moment that I showed him that website, and the way that Eastman talked about the website, he knew. And from then on, he was like one of the most enthusiastic supporters of this movement. So I think him and one other 2003 graduate, David's class of 2003. So I think 2 of his classmates signed it. A bunch of mine did, and we had graduates, I think, as far back as 68, all the way up to maybe like 2014 or 15. So it was a pretty bunch of retired colonels. It was a pretty broad perspective. So we got that published in the Frontiersman. My gamble was that if it was published in his hometown paper, the ADN would cover it as news, which it did. And I think that is sort of what got the ball rolling to begin to give legislators political cover to expel. Again, it's not left-wing Ivan Hodes doing this, or left-wing. I don't even want to talk about the actual left-wingers who were involved. But there was an emerging movement to get Eastman expelled. Some of them were pretty far left, but a bunch of them were not. But this, I think, gave real heft to it. David, of course, and Bob Byrd and all of his little buddies called us, Marxists and communists, like they always do. But like that defies common sense, right? Are 70 West Point graduates calling for a guy to resign because he's in a seditious militia, left wingers? No, and most people knew that, and so that started the ball rolling. I had this online petition that I was organizing. People started signing it. Some significant figures in Alaska politics signed it. Johnny Ellis signed it. And so it was picking up momentum going into the beginning of session in January. You may remember like that first week or two of session in 2022. Yeah, it was this year.
Yeah.
2022 was basically like the David Eastman show. So there was this initial effort to getting kicked off committees. And then I ran into the exact same dilemma that is facing us now. So in 2022, in the spring of 2022, so I knew that expulsion was going to be a heavy lift because there were structural reasons for the majority to oppose it and sort of structural reasons for the minority to oppose it. What I did think should have happened, absolutely no question, is that he should have been removed from committees at the beginning of the session. I don't think that would have, led voters to not vote for him, but it's just a principle thing. Like, a guy who posts links to Holocaust denial websites and lies about it shouldn't be on the fucking ethics committee of a state legislature. They just were not willing to do anything resembling any form of sanction. And I guess the thinking was, we did that before with the Alaska Native remarks. He got censured and nothing happened, right? He got reelected. So I get that, but to me, it's not even necessarily about the consequences to him. It's about the consequences to you and what you're willing to say. So, 20 years from now, there was an anti-Semite in the Alaska State Legislature. Did you do anything about it? Like, I wouldn't want to, look a kid or a young person in the eye and say, no, I knew he was bad, but we couldn't do anything because it was inexpedient. So that really, really disillusioned me. And, the Constitution doesn't say shall not hold office unless it's politically inconvenient. It says shall not hold office. So I think there was I think they had a constitutional duty to at least try to expel, but I can wrap my head around the political, like we talked about, there would have been real world consequences to the legislative agenda had he been expelled. So I do get that. I will never, ever get not censoring him, not saying a word about either the Holocaust, officially saying a word about either the Holocaust denial or the COVID stuff or the Oath Keepers membership. Which brings us to the court case, right? So there's statutory language in Alaska that says that the Division of Elections makes determinations about the eligibility of candidates. And there's also statutory legislation basically saying, sensibly, like, an ineligible candidate can't hold public office. So to me, and to Randall Kowalski and the Northern Justice Project, the plain implication is that if somebody is ineligible for whatever reason, not just residency, but because they're a member of an organization that calls for violence, then that's a matter of concern to the Division of Elections. So me and a bunch of other people, maybe about a dozen people, ended up doing this because it's much bigger lift than just like clicking a signature, right? But about a dozen people wrote letters to, filled out eligibility complaints to the Division of Elections. And one guy who did that was a man named Randall Kowalski. He's a former assemblyman, I think, up in the Valley. Used to be in Eastman's district, voted for Eastman, I think, as recently as 2018 or maybe even 2020. But after the Oath Keepers thing came out, was like all the way gone. Randall was, I believe he was the guy who Bill Walker nominated to fill the Senate seat now held by Mike Shower. And I believe that the Senate Republicans rejected him because he's on the moderate side. So he's a moderate Republican, like me, kind of got disillusioned with parties in general, is no longer a Republican, but lifelong Republican, volunteered for Goldwater. He's an older guy, that kind of thing. Just like utterly disenchanted with what became of a certain wing of the Republican Party with Eastman as the representative. So he was a guy that filed one, and I somehow got in touch with him. I honestly don't remember how what the link there was, but eventually I got in touch with him. He agreed to write a letter, and then I was already in contact with Northern Justice Project about doing a lawsuit on the presumption that the Division of Elections would reject the claim, and they decided he would be the right plaintiff. So the Division of Elections comes back, sends all of us who filed a response basically saying, we're aware that Eastman is an oath keeper, but that doesn't disqualify him. And basically making the claim that they have no capacity to investigate. And that's probably true. Like, that's not what that office is set up for. But, I don't have the capacity to do half the stuff that I was asked to do as a teacher, right? That's not funded, right. But I still had to do it. So to me, they shirked their statutory responsibility, which is why they were included in the lawsuit. So the lawsuit is basically against DOE for trying to punt. It's basically saying, no, you have a statutory obligation to do this, you didn't do it, so that needs to be remedied. And then against Eastman, because that's how eligibility lawsuits essentially work. You actually you sue the person of the candidate. So Eastman obtained the legal services of one Joe Miller, a name that should be familiar in Alaska politics. He's a sort of a right-wing guy up in Fairbanks who ran against Lisa Murkowski.
Was the Republican candidate in
2010.
2010.
That's where Lisa Murkowski won that write-in campaign. And then I think he ran again in 2012 or 14 or something. So he's a thrice-failed Senate candidate. And he's also, by the way, a West Point grad. He's 89, 99, 91, somewhere around there. And they've basically thrown a variety of arguments at the wall, like some of them truly absurd, like Oath Keepers no longer exists as an organization, therefore Eastman can't be a member. But some of it with some heft and some weight. And the most obvious issue, the most valid issue, is that this clause of the Constitution is violative of the federal First Amendment, which is supreme. And I get that. There is tension. Does it violate the First Amendment freedom of association? In other words, should people like setting aside the factual matter. So the factual question is, does this organization advocate violence against the United States government? And to me, that's an obvious yes, because they planned January 6th, right? And they carried out violence. And again, it doesn't matter what their bylaws say. Organizations are what they do, right? So when you have the leader of the organization saying, prepare for a bloody civil war, prepare your mind and body. He was not talking in metaphorical terms. They're literally shipping weapons. And when he's doing that in his, this is not a side hustle of his, right? This is Stuart Rhodes, yes. Stuart Rhodes was the head of the Oath Keepers, which, by the way, still exists as an organization. It is a registered nonprofit in Nevada. It has a board. Stuart Rhodes is the president. He's the leader. He wasn't doing this as a side project. He was using the Oath Keepers website, using Oath Keepers mechanism. No member of the Oath Keepers has ever disciplined him, disavowed him. People have left the group, certainly, but there's never, ever, ever been an official sanction. The Oath Keepers as an organization have never distanced themselves. And again, he's the leader. He's using the resources. So the plain reading is that it's his organization. He's advocating the violence. Therefore, the organization is too. And again, the plaintiffs' attorneys have made this point repeatedly. All that David Eastman would have to do to make the bottom fall out of this case is say, there doesn't seem to be a way to officially remove myself from the Oath Keepers organization, but I believe myself to have left the Oath Keepers. I do not believe I am an Oath Keeper any longer. If he says that probably collapses the case. But he won't, and we know why. Because he believes all that shit. In fact, in a sworn statement that he did for this case, he says that he doesn't consider Joe Biden the lawfully elected president. So he believes all the stuff that Stuart Rhodes believes. So that's the factual question. The two factual questions are: is David a member? Obviously, he says he was. He's a lifetime member. He's even more involved than he has admitted, which came out. So is he a member? Yes. Do they advocate violence? Seems pretty obviously yes to me. And there, there's a possibility. Do organizations have views and beliefs separate from their leadership? Maybe. So I can see that. And then there's the constitutional issue, which is, even if it's an organization that advocates this, is mere membership in this organization protected by the First Amendment? So, in other words, can any state government impose any kind of punishment, even if it's just disqualification from public office, on somebody just for being a member of a heinous organization? My dad, for example, retired constitutional law professor, thinks no. He thinks I'm wrong.
Jeff Landfield of the Alaska Landmine interviewed David Eastman on his podcast a couple of months ago. I interviewed Jeff 2 weeks ago on this podcast, and I asked him some questions about that interview. One of the things that we talked about was, yes, the U.S. Constitution guarantees a freedom of speech, but it's not a freedom from consequences. To me, yes, David Eastman can be part of the Oath Keepers, but the consequences that, because of the Alaska Constitution, he cannot also be a legislator. Jeff Landfield argued that the consequences should be at the voting booth. So David Eastman has been reelected multiple times with ease. Can you talk a little bit about that?
If the only determination of candidate eligibility is the will of the voters, why is that clause in the Constitution? If it is never meant to be enforced, why is it there? And there's historical reasons for that. It is absolutely correct that it was a relic of the McCarthy era, designed to not allow communists in the state legislature. I get that. I'm not even sure that it's a great clause to have, but it's still there. And that's the rule of law, right? You don't just enforce the laws that you like. You have to enforce all of them. If you don't like it, get rid of it. We have a constitutional amendment process, right? I agree that it is an extreme remedy. 99.9% of the time, the voters should have the final say. But this is an extreme case. Like, we have a state legislator who belongs to an organization that
he refuses to
renounce, that advocates through word and deed the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. They think and thought that the Biden regime is illegitimate, and they were planning to install, in the case of January 6th, prevent it from taking power. But now that it's in, until they all got arrested, they were advocating. They were saying it's illegitimate and prepare for civil war. So the organization, in word and deed, was calling for that. So the Constitution says you can't belong to a group that does X. The group does X, and that's it. And again, I am 100% willing to admit that I might be wrong. That's for the judge to decide. But I think the judge absolutely has the power, the authority, the responsibility to make that decision, to adjudicate that. The Constitution, the law, the facts and the law seem clear to me, but I'm not a lawyer. My dad thinks I'm wrong. Maybe the judge will think I'm wrong. I'm prepared for that.
We do ask our guests at the end if there's a particular book they want our listeners to read. Do you have a book that you recommend?
Does it have to be about...
No.
Okay.
Whatever you want.
Yeah. My being an officer is such an important part of who I am. And the idea that another officer, particularly another West Pointer, is behaving in this way as a public official, like, that is what lights the fire here. So on that note, the book that speaks the most about the officer corps and West Pointers and going to war and all that is a book called The Long Gray Line, The American Journey of the West Point Class of 66. And it's about, just as it says, a group of, follows about 4 or 5 cadets from the time they arrive at the academy in the summer of 1962 through their time at the academy as the Vietnam War is getting underway. Then they all go to Vietnam, and then they spend the next decade or so. I believe the narrative ends in about 1986. So basically about being a cadet before the war, going to war, and then coming back from the war and managing all of that. And I tell people that
Who's it by?
Rick Atkinson. He was a journalist at the time. He's moved more into military history. He wrote the Army of Liberation trilogy about World War II, and I think he's got a trilogy now about the American Revolution underway. And I tell people that I've never read a book about Iraq or Afghanistan, meaning the wars, because that's too close. So the story of Vietnam, and particularly the officer corps in Vietnam, I read about that all of the time to help me process what happened to myself in Iraq, right? So I would definitely recommend that, A, for anybody who wants to understand me and what motivates me in this weird little crusade that I've got going on, and B, just what the American experience in Vietnam did to Americans, because there are parallels to Iraq and Afghanistan and the consequences it had on our politics, for sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Big thanks to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. Please check out his website, anchoragelife.net, and his YouTube channel, also called Anchorage Life. And thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us.